27 mounted figures circled a veteran's cabin somewhere in rural Tennessee on the night of April 14, 1871. Court records from Davidson County mention only that an incident occurred before the entire case file disappeared from public archives. What makes this particular siege different from dozens of similar attacks during Reconstruction? The man inside that cabin had killed 247 Confederate soldiers during the war, each one from distances exceeding 800 yards. Military historians have spent decades trying to verify his service record, only to find that most documentation related to his unit was destroyed in the 1873 War Department fire. But 7 letters written by Union officers discovered in a Virginia estate sale in 1954 confirm one disturbing detail: he never missed. The Nightriders who surrounded his property that spring evening had no idea what they were walking into. Before we continue with the story of what happened in that isolated hollow, if you're watching from Tennessee, Kentucky, or anywhere in the South, let us know in the comments what state you're from, because what I'm about to tell you might have happened closer to your hometown than you think. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this one don't make it into history books, and you'll want to hear how this night unfolded. Now, to understand why 27 men rode through the darkness toward one man's home, we need to go back 6 years earlier to the final months of the war. The Cumberland Plateau in 1865 was a landscape of contradictions. Union victory had been declared, but in the remote valleys and hollows stretching across the Tennessee-Kentucky border, the war had never really ended. Small communities clung to mountainsides, connected by roads that turned to rivers of mud each spring. Most families had sent sons to fight, some wearing blue, others gray, and the bitterness of those choices poisoned wells and split churches down their center aisles. Nathaniel Hardin had returned to this fractured world in late November 1865, arriving on foot because he'd sold his discharge pay to a sutler for enough money to buy the plot of land he'd been dreaming about for 4 years. He was 31 years old, born free in Pennsylvania to a mother who'd escaped bondage and a father who worked the iron furnaces. He'd learned to shoot squirrels at age 7 with a rifle that kicked hard enough to bruise his shoulder purple. By the time he was 15, he could hit a playing card at 200 paces. The war had refined those skills into something far more lethal. His service record, what little survived, showed he'd enlisted in the 54th Pennsylvania Infantry in August 1862, but transferred to sharpshooter duty after his company commander witnessed him drop a Confederate officer from a distance the other soldiers swore was impossible. He'd spent 3 years in a unit that existed in official documents only as Special Detachment, Army of the Cumberland. The men in these units didn't fight in lines. They moved alone or in pairs, reading wind and elevation, learning to slow their heartbeat before squeezing a trigger. Hardin had chosen his property carefully, 47 acres in a hollow, 12 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a wagon track that climbed through dense oak and hickory. A creek ran through the property year-round, and the land was poor enough that nobody else had wanted it. He'd built his cabin from logs he'd cut himself, notching them tight and chinning with creek clay mixed with grass. The structure was small, maybe 16 feet square, with a loft for sleeping and a stone fireplace he'd constructed from river rock. He kept to himself that first winter, appearing in Elkton only twice a month to buy supplies: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. The town had perhaps 300 residents, most of them trying to rebuild what the war had broken. The bank had reopened. The church held services again. But underneath the attempts at normalcy ran currents of rage and humiliation that never quite surfaced in daylight. People noticed Hardin, of course, a black man who owned property, who walked with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, who paid in coin rather than credit. These things drew attention. But he was unfailingly polite, spoke only when spoken to, and never mentioned his service. The merchants took his money. The conversation stopped when he entered rooms. By spring of 1866, he'd cleared 3 acres and planted corn. He'd built a chicken coop and bought 6 hens from a widow whose husband had died at Shiloh. He was building something that looked remarkably like a future. That's when people started asking questions. A former Confederate lieutenant named Josiah Ketchum had returned to Elkton around the same time as Hardin. Ketchum had lost his left arm at Missionary Ridge and walked with a limp from a Minier bull that had shattered his hip. He'd come home to find his family's farm sold for tax debt and his mother living with his sister's family in 2 rooms above the dry goods store. The bitterness had curdled into something darker than grief. Ketchum spent his evenings in the back room of Patterson's Tavern with 7 or 8 other veterans, men whose farms had been burned, whose brothers hadn't come home, whose entire world had been turned inside out. They drank whiskey that tasted like kerosene and talked in voices that got louder as the night wore on. "There's a colored living up in Shepherd's Hollow," someone mentioned one evening in early March 1866. "Built himself a whole cabin, got livestock. Where'd he get money for land?" another asked. "Served with the Union," Ketchum said quietly. "I asked around. Pennsylvania Regiment, they say. Sharpshooter." The word hung in the tobacco smoke like an accusation. These men understood what sharpshooters did. They'd all seen bodies lying in positions that made no sense, killed by shots that came from tree lines half a mile distant. They'd all felt that particular species of terror, knowing that somewhere out there, someone was watching through a scope, choosing who would die next. "How many you think he killed?" someone asked. Nobody answered, but the silence was its own kind of response. The first incident happened on a Saturday in mid-April 1866. Hardin had walked to town for supplies, his rifle slung across his back the way he always carried it. Not threatening, just practical. A man living alone in hill country needed to hunt. He'd bought flour and coffee, some nails, a new rasp for his tools. He was loading his purchases into a canvas sack when 3 men approached him outside the general store. Ketchum was one of them. The other 2 were brothers named Vernon and Cecil Tyree, both of whom had served in the 20th Tennessee Infantry. Vernon still wore his Confederate shell jacket, the buttons replaced but the gray wool unmistakable. "Heard you were a soldier," Ketchum said. His tone was conversational, but there was something underneath it, like ice forming on a pond. "Yes, sir," Hardin replied, not quite meeting his eyes, a habit of survival that predated the war. "Kill many of our boys?" Hardin adjusted the sack on his shoulder. "I did what I was ordered to do." "Bet you did." Vernon Tyree stepped closer. "Bet you enjoyed it too." "Sitting safe in a tree somewhere, shooting men who couldn't shoot back." "I served my country same as you served yours," Hardin said evenly. "War's over now." "That's where you're wrong," Ketchum said softly. "War ain't over. Won't be over for a long time." Hardin walked away without responding. He felt their eyes on his back for the entire length of Main Street. When he finally turned onto the wagon track leading to his hollow, his hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the weight of the supplies. 2 weeks later, someone shot his dog. The animal had been sleeping on the cabin porch when the bullet took it through the chest, a clean shot from distance. Hardin buried the dog behind the cabin and said nothing to anyone, but he started sleeping with his rifle within arm's reach. In early May, he found his cornfield torn up, every seedling pulled from the ground and scattered. Boot prints in the soft earth showed at least 4 different men. He replanted, working through the night by moonlight, and built a scarecrow that he dressed in an old Union jacket. The scarecrow was burning when he came back from checking his traps the next morning. Someone had doused it in coal oil and set it ablaze. The jacket had burned completely, leaving only the wooden frame and a scorch mark on the ground that looked like a grave. That evening, Hardin sat on his porch as darkness gathered in the hollow. The spring peepers were singing in the creek bottom, and somewhere an owl called out 3 times. He was cleaning his rifle, a .52 caliber Sharps with a scope he'd acquired during the war, glass ground by a German optician in Cincinnati who'd understood what precision meant. The weapon could put a bullet through a man's heart at 1,000 yards if the wind was right. He heard them before he saw them. Horses moving through the woods, trying to be quiet, but betraying themselves with the crack of branches and the jingle of bridles. Hardin stood slowly, moving into the cabin doorway but not inside. He counted the sounds, estimating numbers and positions the way he'd been trained. They emerged from the tree line just as the last light died in the western sky. 27 riders, some carrying torches that threw wild shadows across the clearing. Most wore hoods, white fabric crudely sewn with eye holes that made them look less than human. But Hardin recognized horses, saddles, the way certain men sat their mounts. Ketchum was there, his empty left sleeve pinned to his jacket. The Tyree brothers, others he'd seen in town. They formed a loose circle around the cabin, maybe 70 yards out, far enough to feel safe from a shotgun, close enough to make their point. "Nathaniel Hardin," Ketchum's voice carried across the clearing. "You've been given warnings. You chose not to heed them. This land doesn't belong to you. This whole valley doesn't belong to your kind." Hardin said nothing. He was calculating distances, reading wind from the way the torch flames bent, noting which riders had weapons visible and which kept their hands hidden. "We're offering you one final chance," Ketchum continued. "Leave tonight. Walk away from this property and nobody gets hurt. Stay and we'll burn you out. Those are your choices." One of the hooded riders raised a torch higher. Others began to dismount. That's when Hardin spoke, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry. "I count 27 of you. I'm curious, how many of you are planning to make it home tonight?" The movement toward the cabin stopped. "You threatening us?" Vernon Tyree called out. "You're alone, boy. We're 27 strong." "I know exactly how many you are," Hardin said. "Question is whether you know what I am." He stepped forward slightly, letting them see the rifle in his hands, letting them remember what sharpshooters did during the war. "First man who takes another step toward this cabin dies before his foot touches ground," Hardin said, his voice still calm, almost conversational. "Second man dies before the first one hits earth. I figure I can drop 8 of you before you scatter. Maybe 10 if you panic and bunch up. Those are military odds, gentlemen. How many of you want to be in that first 10? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of horses shifting nervously, picking up on the tension their riders were feeling. "You can't kill all of us," Ketchum said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Don't need to kill all of you," Hardin replied, "just need to kill enough. And here's what you need to understand. I'll start with the leaders. That means you, Ketchum. You'll be first. Then Vernon Tyree, because you're the one who killed my dog. After that I'll work my way through whoever looks most eager. By the time I'm on my 5th or 6th shot, the rest of you will be running so hard you'll leave your horses behind." One of the torchbearers, Hardin couldn't see who, let his torch drop to the ground and moved his horse backward out of the circle. "He's bluffing," someone said, but the voice lacked conviction. "You want to test that theory?" Hardin asked. "Because I served 3 years in a unit that specialized in making men like you regret their choices. I've got enough ammunition in this cabin to hold off an army. I've got a creek for water and enough jerky to last a month. What I'm asking is, how long do you want to sit out there in the open while I pick you off one by one?" The truth was more complicated than Hardin made it sound. He had perhaps 40 rounds for the sharps, and once darkness fully settled, accurate shooting would become nearly impossible even with the torchlight. But these men didn't know that. What they knew was the stories they'd heard about Union sharpshooters, about impossible shots and men who could kill from distances that defied belief. Another rider moved his horse backward, then another. "This isn't over," Ketchum said, but he was already turning his mount. "Didn't figure it was," Hardin replied. "But tonight is. Ride out now and nobody dies. Stay, and at least 8 of you won't see morning. Your choice." The circle broke. Riders turned their horses and melted back into the darkness, the torches bobbing away through the trees like marsh lights. Within 5 minutes, the clearing was empty except for 3 abandoned torches guttering in the dirt. Hardin stood in his doorway until the last sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he went inside, barred the door, and positioned himself at the window with a clear line of sight to the tree line. He didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. The siege of April 14th, 1871, didn't materialize from nowhere. The 5 years between Hardin's first confrontation and that spring night had been a slow escalation, a war fought in shadows and whispers, in burned fields and dead livestock, in warnings left on fence posts and bullets fired from tree lines. But something had changed in those years, something that made Hardin's presence in the hollow not just annoying but intolerable to certain men. He'd survived. More than that, he'd prospered. By 1867, Hardin had expanded his cultivated land to 12 acres. He'd built a proper barn, shingled with cedar splits he'd made himself. His corn yielded well in the hollow's rich bottomland, and he'd started keeping hogs, smart enough to know that pork was currency in hill country. Other black families had begun settling in the region, freed people coming up from Alabama and Georgia, following rumors of land and opportunity. Some of them sought out Hardin, asking advice, and he gave it freely. In the fall of 1868, he did something that turned dislike into hatred. He registered to vote. The Reconstruction Acts had given black men suffrage, and Hardin walked into Elkton on a bright October morning and put his name in the register. He voted for the Republican candidate for state legislature. His ballot, like thousands of others across Tennessee, helped elect men committed to protecting freed people's rights. The backlash was immediate and organized. What had been random harassment became systematic intimidation. The Ku Klux Klan had always operated in the region, but now their activities intensified. Nightriders appeared throughout the county, burning schoolhouses where black children studied, whipping men who'd voted, terrorizing communities. They came to Hardin's Hollow 3 times in 1869. Each time he met them the same way, standing in his doorway with his rifle, calmly explaining the mathematics of violence. Each time they retreated without testing his resolve. But they were learning, adapting. The 4th visit came differently. No torches, no shouting. Just 5 men on foot, moving through the woods in darkness, approaching from multiple directions. Hardin heard them anyway. He'd spent too many years listening for the sounds that meant danger. He fired twice, aiming high, letting them know he was aware. They withdrew, but they'd made their point. They were getting smarter. In early 1870, Hardin married. Her name was Ruth Ann Kincaid, and she'd come north from Mississippi with her brother's family, fleeing a county where freed people were being killed for owning land. She was 24 years old, educated by missionaries, and she saw in Hardin something that most people missed. Not just strength, but a kind of stubborn hope that the world could be different than it was. They married in a church 12 miles away, with 14 people in attendance. Hardin built an addition to the cabin, 4 rooms instead of 1, with real windows that had glass. Ruth Ann started a small school, teaching children from the scattered black families in the Hollow and the surrounding area. 6 students at first, then 9, then 14. The schoolhouse, just 1 room attached to their cabin, became a symbol of everything certain white men in Elkton couldn't tolerate. It wasn't just that black people were being educated. It was that they were building something that looked permanent, something that suggested they weren't going anywhere. In March 1871, 3 of Ruth Ann's students were attacked while walking home. 2 boys and a girl, ages 9 to 12, beaten badly enough that 1 boy lost vision in his left eye. No arrests were made. The marshal in Elkton claimed there were no witnesses. Ruth Ann wanted to leave. "We can go north," she told Hardin one night as they lay in darkness, listening to the creek run through the hollow. "Pennsylvania, Ohio. Somewhere you're not looking over your shoulder every minute. This is our land," Hardin said quietly. "We paid for it, built on it. I'm not running because some cowards hide under sheets." "They'll kill you," Ruth Ann said. "They'll kill both of us." "Maybe," Hardin admitted. "But I spent 4 years fighting so people like us could own land, could vote, could live free. If I run now, what was it all for?" She didn't answer, because they both knew there was no good answer. Just choices, all of them bad in different ways. The final provocation came on April 12, 1871. Someone burned the schoolroom, not the whole cabin, just the addition where Ruth Ann taught. They'd been careful, using coal oil and rags, making sure the fire didn't spread to the living quarters. The message was clear. They could have killed you, but we're giving you one more chance. Hardin and Ruth Ann stood in the ashes the next morning, looking at charred books and melted slate boards. 14 children's primers, purchased with money they could barely spare, reduced to carbon. "We're leaving," Ruth Ann said. It wasn't a question this time. Hardin nodded slowly. "After I teach them one last lesson." "What lesson?" "That some things have a price." That night, Ruth Ann went to stay with a family 8 miles away, on the other side of the ridge. Hardin told her he needed to pack, to prepare for the journey north. But what he was really preparing for was something quite different. He spent 2 days readying his cabin. He knew they'd come. The burned schoolroom was an ultimatum, and his failure to leave would demand a response. So he prepared his ground the way a military man prepares a battlefield. He cut firing positions into the cabin's walls, narrow slits that allowed him to see out, but were almost impossible to shoot through from outside. He positioned water barrels at strategic points in case of fire. He stacked ammunition at each firing port, and made detailed calculations about distances and angles. Most importantly, he did something that would only become clear later. He documented everything in letters. 7 letters to be exact. Written over those 2 days, sealed in wax, addressed to Union officers he'd served with, to a newspaper editor in Philadelphia, to a politician in Washington. The letters described what had happened since he'd returned to Tennessee, named names, provided dates. He left them in a metal box buried near the creek, with instructions written on the cabin wall for Ruth Ann to retrieve them if he didn't survive. The night of April 14th, 1871, was moonless and cold for mid-spring. Hardin sat in his cabin, rifle across his lap, listening to the darkness. They came at midnight. 27 riders appeared from the tree line, just as they had 5 years earlier. But everything else was different. These weren't hooded Nightriders with torches and bluster. These were military men executing a military operation. They'd dismounted a quarter-mile away, leaving their horses tied. They'd approached from 4 directions simultaneously, using terrain and darkness for cover. Half of them carried rifles, the others held torches, but kept them unlit until the signal. Ketchum was there again, but he wasn't leading this time. The leader was a man named Robert Calhoun, a former Confederate major who'd commanded a regiment at Franklin and had lost 73 men in 15 minutes during that slaughter. He'd returned to Tennessee with military precision still wired into his bones, and he'd been planning this operation for 2 weeks. The strategy was simple. Surround the cabin at close range, light the torches simultaneously to blind anyone inside, then rush the structure from all 4 sides. If Hardin came out shooting, concentrate fire on the doorway. If he stayed inside, burn him out. Either way, he'd be dead by dawn. What Calhoun hadn't accounted for was that Nathaniel Hardin had spent 3 years learning to think like his enemies, to anticipate their movements, to understand how military men approached problems. And Hardin had one crucial advantage. He knew exactly how many men were coming and where they'd position themselves. He'd seen them scouting his property 3 days earlier. 2 men pretending to hunt, but moving in patterns that suggested reconnaissance. He'd counted boot prints around his property line and calculated probable approach routes based on terrain and cover. Most importantly, he understood that they'd learned from their previous failures. They wouldn't bunch up this time. They'd use proper infantry tactics, so he'd prepared accordingly. The first man to reach the cabin perimeter, a position roughly 40 yards from the structure, was named James Murdoch. He was 36 years old, a farmer who'd lost his eldest son at Gettysburg. He was creeping forward through the darkness, rifle in one hand, unlit torch in the other, when Hardin's first shot took him through the thigh. The bullet didn't kill him, and that was intentional. Hardin had aimed low, choosing wounding over killing because a wounded man screams, and screaming creates chaos. Murdoch's cry shattered the carefully planned silence. Men froze, trying to locate the shot's origin. In that moment of confusion, Hardin fired twice more, both shots hitting dirt 2 feet in front of advancing men, close enough to send gravel into their faces. Next one's through bone, Hardin's voice carried from the cabin. Now you've got a choice to make. Calhoun, positioned at the tree line, made a decision. Light torches, he commanded. Rush the cabin. 14 torches flared to life simultaneously, turning the clearing into a landscape of wild shadows and flickering light. Men began running toward the cabin from 4 directions. Hardin had perhaps 8 seconds before they reached the walls. He used them carefully. His second shot took Vernon Tyree through the right shoulder, spinning him around and putting him on the ground. The third shot hit the torch in Cecil Tyree's hand, exploding it and showering him with burning pitch. The fourth shot hit dirt directly in front of the 3 men approaching from the east, and his fifth, this one he'd calculated for maximum psychological impact, struck a water barrel that Hardin had deliberately positioned 40 yards from his cabin, filled with creek water and sealed tight. The barrel exploded from the bullet's impact, soaking the 4 nearest attackers and dousing 2 torches in the spray. By now the assault was already faltering. Men who'd been running were diving for cover, trying to understand how someone inside a dark cabin was hitting targets with precision that should have been impossible in these conditions. What they couldn't see was that Hardin had spent 2 days memorizing the terrain, calculating the exact positions where torch-bearing men would create specific shadow patterns, identifying the natural shooting lanes where backdrop and angle would make targets visible even in darkness. He'd fought this battle in his mind 100 times before they arrived. "You're down 3 men and you haven't reached the walls," Hardin called out. His voice was steady, almost conversational. "I've got 37 rounds left and all night to use them. Calhoun, you're behind the large oak, 70 yards northwest. You think that tree's thick enough to stop a .52 caliber bullet?" Silence. Then Calhoun's voice tight with fury. "How did you—" "I know exactly where every one of you is," Hardin interrupted. "Man behind the hickory to my left is wearing his old uniform jacket. I can see the buttons reflecting torchlight. Man prone behind the fallen log to the south, you're breathing so hard I can hear you from here. You all made one critical mistake. You brought torches to a night fight. Every torch is a beacon, showing me exactly where you are. Someone, Hardin couldn't tell who, fired at the cabin. The bullet hit logs and sparked. Hardin didn't return fire. He was counting shots, tracking who was shooting, calculating ammunition expenditure. One of you just wasted a round on solid oak," Hardin said. "You've got maybe 30 more shots between all of you, assuming you brought full loads. I've got enough ammunition to outlast you by morning, and come daylight, you'll be the ones exposed in an open field while I'm behind cover. So here's my offer, and it's the only one you'll get. Take your wounded and ride out. Do it now, and I'll let you leave. Stay, and I start killing instead of wounding." "You're bluffing," someone shouted. Hardin's response was a single shot that hit the ground 3 inches from Calhoun's boot, sending up a spray of dirt that struck his leg. "That wasn't a miss," Hardin said quietly. "That was a demonstration. Next one goes through your skull, Calhoun. You've got 10 seconds to start moving backward." But the silence that followed was broken by Murdoch's groaning. He was still on the ground, bleeding, needing medical attention. "Get Murdoch," Calhoun finally said. "Fall back to the tree line." "We're retreating," someone protested. "We're regrouping," Calhoun corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. Men began moving backward, dragging Murdoch with them, retrieving Vernon Tyree. The torches retreated like fireflies, bobbing away through the darkness. Within 10 minutes, the clearing was empty again. But this time was different. This time, they didn't leave. From his position inside the cabin, Hardin could see the torches gathered at the tree line, perhaps 100 yards distant. They were talking, arguing probably, trying to decide what to do next. He'd won the first engagement, but he understood military reality. He'd only delayed them. They couldn't leave now, not after being humiliated twice by a single man. Pride and rage would force them to try again, and next time, they'd be smarter. Hardin reloaded his rifle and checked his other weapons, 2 pistols and a shotgun, plus the ammunition he'd stacked at each firing port. He'd told them he had 37 rounds left. The truth was closer to 60, but he wanted them to think he was counting carefully, rationing shots. At the tree line, Calhoun was indeed arguing with his men. Several wanted to leave, to come back with more people to burn Hardin out during daylight. But others, particularly the Tyree brothers' cousins, wanted blood now. Pride had been wounded, and wounded pride demands immediate satisfaction. "He can't watch all 4 sides at once," someone pointed out. "We rush him again, but this time some of us create a distraction while others get to the walls." "And who volunteers to be the distraction?" another voice asked. "The man's already proved he can hit targets in the dark. You want to be the one drawing his fire." While they argued, Hardin was doing something they wouldn't expect. He was preparing to change tactics. He couldn't hold the cabin indefinitely against 27 determined men. Eventually, they'd overwhelm him or burn him out. He needed to make them believe the cost was too high, not just for tonight, but forever. He took one of the letters he'd written and placed it prominently on the table, weighted down with a stone. Then he did something that seemed like madness. He opened his cabin door. The torches at the tree line stopped moving. Hardin stepped out onto his porch, rifle in hand, but pointed down and called out across the clearing, "Calhoun, you and I need to talk." Silence. Then, Talk about what? About what happens when I die, Hardin said. Because we both know that's what this is about. You're not leaving until one of us is dead, so let's discuss the consequences. What consequences? You'll be dead. True, Hardin acknowledged. But so will at least 8 of you, probably more. And here's what you haven't considered. I've documented everything. Every attack, every threat, every name. I've written it all down in letters that are already sealed and hidden. If I die tonight, those letters get mailed. They're going to union officers, to newspapers, to politicians in Washington who are very interested in how Reconstruction is being enforced. He paused, letting that sink in. You think you can kill me and walk away? Hardin continued. But you're wrong. Those letters name names. They describe incidents. They provide dates and details. Every man here tonight will be identified as part of a murder conspiracy. The federal government will have no choice but to investigate, and unlike the local marshal, federal investigators can't be intimidated or bought off. You're lying, Calhoun said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The letters are in a metal box buried near my creek, Hardin said. Instructions for finding them are written on the wall inside my cabin. My wife knows to look for them if I don't return. You can kill me, Calhoun, but you can't silence me. I've already spoken to people you can't touch. This was the truth, or close enough to it. The letters existed. They were hidden. Ruth Ann did have instructions. What Hardin was gambling on was something he'd observed during the war. Most men, when faced with the choice between immediate violence and long-term legal consequences, will choose to avoid the legal consequences. They'll tell themselves they're being strategic, biding their time, waiting for a better opportunity. But really, they're looking for an excuse to quit. So here's my proposal, Hardin said. You ride out tonight. You leave me alone. In exchange, those letters stay buried. Nobody gets investigated. Nobody goes to federal prison. You get to pretend you're honorable men instead of cowards who hide under sheets. I get to live on my land in peace. Everybody wins. And if we refuse, Calhoun asked, then we fight until one of us is dead, Hardin said simply. And either way, those letters get mailed. Either I mail them after killing 8 of you, or my wife mails them after you kill me. The only question is how many of you die first. The torches at the tree line converged, men huddling in conference. Hardin stood on his porch, exposed, gambling that they wouldn't shoot him during a parley. It was a calculated risk based on these men's self-image. They thought of themselves as soldiers, not assassins, and soldiers honored certain codes. The conference lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then Calhoun stepped forward, into the edge of the torchlight. You've got a week, he said. 7 days to pack up and leave this county. Take your letters, take your wife, go back north. Do that and nobody bothers you. Stay, and we come back with 100 men. No talking next time. We'll burn you out and deal with the consequences. Hardin had expected this counteroffer. It was a compromise, a way for Calhoun to save face while still accomplishing the objective of removing Hardin from the hollow. No, Hardin said. What? I said no. This is my land. I'm not leaving. Then you're a fool, Calhoun said. Maybe, Hardin agreed. But I'm a fool who's killed 247 men in combat. I'm a fool who's held off 27 of you twice now. I'm a fool who's prepared to die on my own property rather than run from men who hide their faces in the dark. So if that's foolishness, I'll wear it proudly. He raised his rifle slightly, not quite aiming but making the threat clear. This conversation is over, Hardin said. You've got 1 minute to start riding out. After that I start shooting again, and this time I won't be aiming to wound. For a long moment nothing moved except the torch flames dancing in the night wind. Then, one by one, the torches began to retreat. Men mounted their horses in the distance. The sounds of hoofbeats faded slowly into the darkness. Hardin stood on his porch until silence returned to the hollow. Then he went inside, barred the door, and finally allowed himself to shake. They came back 4 nights later, and this time they didn't announce themselves with torches. Hardin woke to the smell of smoke, not coal, oil, and pine, something else, something that made his eyes water immediately. He rolled out of his bed, already coughing, and saw gray vapor seeping through the gaps in his walls. They'd surrounded the cabin in complete darkness and built small fires upwind, feeding them with wet leaves and green wood to create maximum smoke with minimum light. The plan was simple: smoke him out without giving him targets to shoot at. When he emerged, coughing and blind, they'd be waiting. It was a sound tactic, the kind of thing military men would devise after learning from previous failures. Hardin had perhaps 2 minutes before the smoke made the cabin uninhabitable. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, but he didn't open it. Instead, he dropped to the floor, where the air was slightly clearer, and began to think. They expected him to panic, to burst out coughing and desperate. But panic was how men died, and Hardin had long ago learned to control that particular fear. He crawled to the fireplace and began to work quickly, clearing the ashes and exposing the dirt floor beneath. The cabin had been built on a slight rise, and the chimney's foundation went down perhaps 2 feet. He'd dug it himself and knew that if he could create an air channel, he could buy time. Using his hands and a knife, he clawed at the dirt, creating a small pit that filled slowly with air pulled down the chimney by convection. It wasn't much, just enough to take a few clear breaths, but it was enough to think. The smoke continued to thicken. His eyes were streaming now, and each breath burned. He had maybe 3 minutes before he'd lose consciousness. Outside, they'd be waiting in a perimeter, rifles ready, confident that he'd have to emerge soon. Through the walls he could hear them now, low voices coordinating positions, the creak of leather as men shifted their weight, the metallic click of hammers being cocked. They were close, perhaps 30 yards out, forming a killing circle around every possible exit. Hardin pressed his face to the pit he'd dug, taking shallow breaths of clearer air, and forced himself to assess the situation methodically. The smoke was entering from the north side, which meant the fires were positioned there. They'd need at least 4 men tending those fires, keeping them fed with wet material. That left 23 in the perimeter, probably distributed evenly around the cabin. Standard military doctrine would place riflemen at the cardinal points, with support positions filling the gaps. His mind mapped it out: 6 men at north, south, east, and west positions, maybe 5 more scattered between. All of them watching the door and windows, waiting for him to stumble out, gasping for air. But there was another option, one that would cost him everything he'd built, but might save his life. Hardin crawled to the wall facing the creek and began to work on the logs. During construction, he'd deliberately left one section slightly loose, not enough to be obvious, but enough that with the right pressure, 3 logs could be pushed outward. He'd done this because he'd learned during the war that any defensive position needed an escape route. The smoke was a living thing now, a gray monster that filled the cabin from ceiling to floor. He could no longer see his own hands. His lungs screamed for air with each breath, and he knew he was running out of time. He braced his back against the opposite wall and pushed with his legs, feeling the logs shift. Once, twice. On the 3rd push, they moved outward with a crack that seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating darkness. What was that? Someone outside, voice sharp with alertness. "Cabin's settling from the heat," another voice responded. "He's got to come out soon." Hardin pushed again, and the gap widened. Smoke poured through the opening, which would help. It would obscure any movement, make it harder for them to see clearly. He grabbed his rifle, realized it was slick with condensation from the smoke, and made a quick decision. The Sharps was his best weapon, but it needed dry powder and a clear sight line, neither of which he'd have in the next few minutes. He left it and grabbed one of his pistols instead, checking by touch that the powder was still dry. The weapon held 6 shots. Against 27 men, it was nearly useless, but 6 shots could create chaos, and chaos could create opportunity. He squeezed through the gap, pushing himself into the wet grass outside. The smoke followed him out, a gray cloud that spread across the slope leading down to the creek. He dropped flat and began to crawl, moving inch by inch down the incline. Behind him, he heard someone shout, "He's coming out!" But they were watching the door. Several rifles discharged, the muzzle flashes bright in the darkness, bullets slamming into the cabin's front wall. Men were yelling now, calling to each other, trying to coordinate their fire. "Hold your shots," Calhoun's voice cut through the chaos. "Wait until you see him." Hardin reached the creek bank and slid into the water, which was perhaps 3 feet deep and cold enough to shock the breath from his lungs. The current was gentle but steady. He let it carry him downstream, keeping only his nose and eyes above water, using overhanging brush for cover. The sounds of confusion continued behind him. Someone had noticed the gap in the wall and was shouting about it. Torches were being lit now. He could see the glow reflecting off the water. They were searching the perimeter, trying to understand how their quarry had escaped. Hardin let the current take him perhaps 200 yards downstream before pulling himself out behind a massive fallen sycamore. He was soaked, shivering violently, his lungs still burning from the smoke. But he was alive and free of the killing circle they'd prepared. From this distance, he could see his cabin clearly. The smoke fires had done their work too well. The dry oak logs had caught, and now flames were climbing the walls. The structure he'd built with his own hands, every log cut and notched and fitted with precision, was being consumed. 27 men stood around the fire, some still holding rifles, others lowering them as they realized their target had escaped. Hardin could see Calhoun pointing, directing men to search the creek, the woods, anywhere he might have fled. They were spreading out, which meant they were vulnerable. For 5 years Hardin had endured. He'd been patient, diplomatic, had tried every legal avenue to simply be left alone. He'd offered compromises, had shown restraint, even when restraint burned like acid in his chest. He'd been the reasonable one, the civilized one, the man who followed the law while they hid behind sheets and broke every principle they claimed to defend. Now his home was burning. The school where Ruth Ann had taught children to read was ash. The corn he'd planted, the barn he'd built, the future he'd imagined, all of it was being reduced to carbon and memory. Hardin checked his pistol. 6 shots. Not enough to fight, but enough to make a point that would echo through this county for years. He began to move through the woods, circling wide around the burning cabin, using the light from the fire to navigate while staying beyond its reach. The men were spreading out now, searching in pairs, calling to each other. Their voices carried in the night air, giving him their positions. 2 men were moving along the creek, searching the banks. Hardin crouched behind a limestone outcrop and watched them pass within 15 feet, their torch illuminating the water where he'd hidden minutes before. They moved on, and he continued his circle. His target was Calhoun, not to kill. Hardin wasn't a murderer, and even now, even with everything burning, he held to certain lines. But Calhoun needed to understand that this victory was hollow, that driving Hardin out came with a cost that would last longer than one night's triumph. He found his position on a small rise overlooking the clearing. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet into the air, sparks spiraling up into the darkness like malevolent stars. The heat was so intense he could feel it from 100 yards away. Calhoun stood near the front of the cabin, directing the search, occasionally shouting orders. He'd removed his hood. Most of them had, confident now that their work was nearly done. In the firelight, Hardin could see his face clearly. Satisfied, vindicated, already composing the story he'd tell. Hardin raised his pistol, steadied it against a tree, and aimed carefully. Not at Calhoun's head or chest, at his hat, a broad-brimmed felt hat that sat squarely on his head. The shot echoed across the hollow like a thunderclap. Calhoun's hat flew off his head, the bullet passing so close that he actually felt the wind of its passage. He dropped to the ground, shouting, and chaos erupted again. Men dove for cover, rifles swinging toward the tree line, torches being doused. In the confusion, Hardin fired twice more, both shots hitting dirt 5 feet in front of the nearest men, close enough to spray them with debris. "Calhoun!" Hardin's voice carried across the clearing, amplified by rage and smoke-damaged vocal cords. "You wanted to know if I could hit a target at night? Now you know." That was 3 shots, and I missed every one of them on purpose. The next man who moves gets a bullet through his spine. Complete silence. Even the crackling of the burning cabin seemed to quiet. "You've won," Hardin continued, his voice echoing off the ridge walls. "I'm leaving. You'll never see me in this county again, but I want you to understand something, all of you. You didn't drive me out because you were stronger or braver or better. You drove me out because there were 27 of you and 1 of me. That's not courage. That's arithmetic." He paused, watching them frozen in the firelight. "I'm taking my wife, and we're going north," Hardin said. "But before I go, I want you to know that I've documented everything. Every attack, every threat, every name. Those documents are already in the mail, heading to federal authorities who have jurisdiction over this kind of conspiracy. Some of you are going to prison. Not all of you. I'm sure you'll sell out your friends to save yourselves, but enough of you will face consequences that the rest of you will spend years looking over your shoulders. Calhoun had found his voice. You're bluffing. Am I? Hardin's laugh was harsh, damaged by smoke. Your name's first on the list, Robert. Right above Vernon Tyree and James Murdoch and every other man who participated in these attacks. You think I didn't recognize your horses, your voices? You think I didn't memorize every detail the way I was trained to memorize targets? He fired his fourth shot, this one taking a branch off a tree directly above where 5 men were crouching. The branch crashed down among them, causing more scrambling. I've got 2 shots left, Hardin called out. I could use them to kill 2 of you. Maybe I should. Maybe the world would be better off with 2 fewer cowards in it, but I'm not going to, because unlike you, I'm not a murderer. I only kill when the law says it's legal, like during a war or in defense of my property. The burning cabin collapsed with a roar, sending up a column of sparks that lit the entire hollow. In that moment of distraction, Hardin moved, slipping away from his position, circling back toward the path that would take him to Ruth Ann. Go home, he shouted one final time. Tell yourselves you won. Celebrate your victory over one man and his wife. But know this, every time you hear a branch crack in the woods, every time you see movement in your peripheral vision, you'll wonder if it's me. You'll wonder if I came back. You'll spend the rest of your lives wondering if the next shot will be the one that isn't a warning. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving them standing around the burning ruins, rifles pointing at shadows, fear eating at the certainty of their triumph. Hardin reached the Kincaid farm at dawn, moving through woods he'd memorized during his time in the hollow. Ruth Ann was awake already. She'd seen the glow on the horizon and knew what it meant. She met him at the edge of the property, took one look at his soot-blackened face and smoke-damaged eyes, and understood that the life they'd tried to build was over. They didn't speak about it. There was nothing to say that the burning cabin hadn't already articulated. Instead, they gathered what little they could carry and began walking north. But before they left, Hardin dug up the metal box he'd buried near his creek. The letters inside were intact, sealed with wax, addressed to 7 different recipients. He carried that box for 12 miles to the nearest town large enough to have a proper post office. Not Elkton, where the postmaster was cousin to half the men who'd burned his home, but a larger settlement across the county line. He mailed all 7 letters on April 20th, 1871. The postal clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, glanced at the addresses. Union Army headquarters in Washington, the offices of 3 Republican congressmen, a newspaper editor in Philadelphia, and 2 federal marshals, and asked no questions. These going somewhere important? He asked, more out of professional curiosity than suspicion. Yes, Hardin replied. They're going to make some people very unhappy. The investigation that followed was one of 17 launched across the South in 1871 under the Enforcement Acts, legislation specifically designed to combat the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations. But unlike most of these investigations, which founded on local resistance and lack of evidence, the Tennessee case had something unique. A documented timeline created by a trained military observer, corroborated by physical evidence and witnessed by enough people that the conspiracy couldn't be denied. The first arrests came in June 1871. Federal marshals, accompanied by army troops, arrived in Elkton with warrants for 14 men. They'd expected resistance, possibly violence, but found instead a town that had already begun to fracture under the weight of fear. The men Hardin had warned about, the ones who'd think selling out their friends might save them, had already started talking. Within a week, 3 participants had provided detailed testimony in exchange for reduced charges. Their statements confirmed everything in Hardin's letters: dates, locations, participants, conversations. The federal prosecutor found himself with more evidence than he'd dared hope for. The trials began in September 1871 in federal court in Nashville, far enough from Elkton that local intimidation couldn't corrupt the jury pool. The proceedings lasted 6 weeks and revealed not just the attacks on Hardin, but a broader pattern of terror affecting the entire region. Black families driven from their homes, voters whipped for casting Republican ballots, teachers beaten for educating black children. The Hardin case became the centerpiece of a prosecution that exposed systematic violence. Robert Calhoun received 7 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder. The sentence was handed down on October 14, 1871, and the judge's statement was scathing. "You claim to defend Southern honor and civilization, yet you attacked a veteran in the night, destroyed his property, and sought to murder him for the crime of owning land. History will judge which of you better represented civilization." Vernon Tyree got 5 years for assault and conspiracy. His brother Cecil, who'd provided some of the most damning testimony against the others, received a suspended sentence and lifelong contempt from his former friends. James Murdoch, the man Hardin had shot in the leg during the April siege, received 3 years. During his trial, doctors testified about the wound, a through-and-through shot to the thigh that had deliberately missed the femoral artery. "If he'd wanted to kill you," the prosecutor noted, "you'd be dead. The fact that you're alive is evidence of his restraint, not your innocence." 5 other men received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years. The conviction sent shockwaves through Tennessee's Nightrider community. For the first time, there were actual consequences for attacking black citizens, actual penalties that couldn't be negotiated away through local connections or threats. But 7 convictions out of 27 attackers meant 20 men walked free. Some had fled the region before arrest. Others had alibi witnesses, friends and family willing to lie under oath. 3 were acquitted after juries deadlocked on whether hooded attackers could be positively identified. Josiah Ketchum was among those never charged. His participation had ended after the first confrontation in 1866, and while Hardin's letters mentioned him by name, there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. He remained in Elkton, watching from the sidelines as former comrades went to prison, his empty left sleeve a reminder of one war, while another was being adjudicated in federal court. Local sentiment split sharply. Some families felt the prosecutions were justified. Violence was violence regardless of the target. Others saw the convictions as Northern oppression, more evidence that Reconstruction was punishing the South for losing the war. Churches split over the issue. Businesses that served both camps found themselves navigating impossible social terrain. The property in Shepherd's Hollow remained abandoned. A few people suggested it should be sold to pay Hardin's legal fees, though he'd never requested such compensation. Others wanted to burn even the foundation to erase any trace of his presence. In the end, nobody touched it. The charred ruins stood like an accusation, and the hollow acquired a reputation for bringing bad luck to anyone who lingered there too long. County tax records show the property was sold in 1875 to a timber company based in Chattanooga. The company logged the hollow over 2 months in 1876, removing every tree larger than 8 inches in diameter. They left behind stumps and erosion and a creek that ran muddy for years afterward. When the timber played out, they abandoned the land, and it eventually reverted to the state for unpaid taxes. Meanwhile, Nathaniel and Ruth Ann Hardin had settled in Philadelphia, choosing a city large enough that one black veteran could disappear into the population. The city's black community in 1871 numbered perhaps 20,000, including many veterans and their families. Here, at least, Hardin wasn't exceptional for having fought in the war. Nearly every black man his age had served in some capacity. He found work as a carpenter, and his skills, precision joinery, careful measurements, and attention to detail that bordered on obsessive, made him valuable. Within a year, he was working for a furniture maker who supplied wealthy households across the city. The pieces he built were noted for their tight fits and clean lines, each joint cut with the same patience he'd once applied to calculating wind drift and bullet drop. Ruth Ann resumed teaching, this time in a proper school with a building and books and other teachers. She had 14 students the first year, 23 the second. Some were children of veterans like herself and Nathaniel. Others were recently arrived from the South, families following rumors of better opportunities in northern cities. They rented rooms in a boarding house on South Street, close enough to the Schuylkill River that Nathaniel could hear water moving at night. It wasn't the same as the creek in Tennessee, This was broader, muddier, carrying the industrial waste of a growing city. But there was comfort in the sound. Water flowing, time passing, life continuing despite everything. They didn't talk much about Tennessee. The memories were too fresh, too painful, too entangled with rage that had nowhere useful to go. But sometimes, late at night, Ruth Ann would wake to find Nathaniel standing by the window, looking out at the Philadelphia streets, and she knew he was seeing something else. A hollow in Tennessee, a cabin he'd built with his own hands, a future that had been burned to ash. "Do you regret it?" she asked him once in 1873, 2 years after they'd fled north. "Fighting instead of leaving?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. "I regret that it was necessary," he finally said. "I regret that my service in the war wasn't enough to earn me the right to live peacefully. I regret that those men valued their pride more than they valued justice or law or basic human decency." "But do you regret fighting?" "No," he said simply. "Some things are worth defending, even if you lose them in the end. That land was mine. I'd paid for it fairly, built on it honestly. If I'd run the first time they threatened me, I'd have spent the rest of my life wondering if I was a coward. At least now I know I fought for what was mine." "And the men who went to prison?" Ruth Ann asked. "Do you feel justice was served?" 7 out of 27, Nathaniel said. "That's not justice, that's arithmetic. But it's more than most black men get when white men attack them. I suppose I should be grateful for that much." The bitterness in his voice was something new, or perhaps just something he'd finally allowed her to hear. The war had taught him to kill. Tennessee had taught him that all the killing in the world wouldn't earn him equality in the eyes of men who'd decided his skin marked him as inferior. Their first child was born in 1874, a daughter they named Grace. She grew up hearing only fragments of her father's history, mentions of the war, carefully edited stories about life in Tennessee, nothing about smoke-filled cabins or Nightriders circling in the darkness. Nathaniel wanted her to grow up free of that weight, unburdened by knowledge of what hatred could drive men to do. 2 more children followed, born in 1877 and 1880. The family moved to a proper house in 1879, a narrow 3-story building in South Philadelphia with a small yard where Ruth Ann could grow vegetables. Nathaniel built furniture for each room, beds and tables and chairs, each piece solid enough to last generations. He never touched a rifle again. Friends occasionally invited him hunting, knowing his reputation from the war, but he always declined. Whatever relationship he'd had with firearms had died in that Tennessee hollow, burned along with everything else. In 1883, a letter arrived from Tennessee. It was from a lawyer in Nashville, writing to inform Hardin that Josiah Ketchum had died of pneumonia at age 49. The lawyer's letter was brief and businesslike. Ketchum had left instructions in his will that certain items should be returned to Hardin if he could be located. The items arrived 3 weeks later in a wooden crate. Inside was Hardin's Sharps rifle, the one he'd left in the cabin when he fled. Someone had apparently pulled it from the ruins, cleaned it, oiled it, stored it carefully. Along with it was a letter in Ketchum's handwriting, written shortly before his death. The letter was short. "Mr. Hardin, I did not participate in the final attacks on your property, though I know you have no particular reason to believe that. I did not stop them either, which makes me complicit in a different way. I have spent the last 12 years thinking about that night, about the choices made, about the price of pride and rage. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot restore what you lost. But I wanted you to have this weapon returned because it represents something about you that I should have recognized sooner. Your right to defend yourself, to own property, to live as a free man in a country you fought for. I am dying now, and facing judgment that may be more honest than anything men deliver. I wanted you to know that at least one of us understood too late that we were the ones in the wrong." Josiah Ketchum Hardin read the letter 3 times, then showed it to Ruth Ann. They sat together in their Philadelphia parlor, examining the rifle that had once been the line between survival and death. It was still in excellent condition, though Ketchum's care couldn't erase the water damage from that night in the creek or the memories embedded in every carefully machined part. "What will you do with it?" Ruth Ann asked. "I don't know," Hardin admitted. "Sell it maybe, or keep it as a reminder." "Of what?" that even enemies can have moments of clarity, that hate isn't permanent in every heart, that some men, at least, can recognize their mistakes before it's too late. The rifle went into their attic, wrapped in oilcloth, stored in a trunk with his discharge papers and the newspapers from the trials. It remained there for the rest of Hardin's life, untouched but preserved, a piece of history that his children would discover only after his death. Hardin himself lived until 1904, dying at age 70 from complications of pneumonia. The smoke damage to his lungs from that night in April 1871 had never fully healed, and his breathing had been compromised for 33 years. Ruth Ann outlived him by 19 years, remaining active in Philadelphia's black community, teaching until she was 68 years old. In her final interview, given to a black newspaper in Philadelphia in 1922, she was asked about the Tennessee years. By then, enough time had passed that she could speak about it with some distance, though certain details still brought tears to her eyes. "People ask if my husband was bitter," she said. "If he spent his life angry about what was taken from us. The truth is more complicated. He was angry, yes, but he was also proud. Proud that he'd fought back when fighting seemed hopeless. Proud that he'd made them afraid, even if only for a little while. Proud that some of them went to prison for what they did." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What happened in that hollow wasn't about one man or one piece of land," she continued. "It was about whether this country would honor its promises to the people who'd fought for it, whether service and sacrifice meant anything, or whether skin color would always matter more. My husband proved that at least one black veteran wouldn't be driven off without a fight. That mattered to him. It should matter to all of us." The interviewer asked if she'd ever return to Tennessee. "Never," Ruth Ann said firmly. "There was nothing left to return to. The land was logged and abandoned. The cabin was ash. The people who'd helped us were scattered or dead. Tennessee took our future from us. Why would I go back to the grave of something I'd loved?" But then her expression softened slightly. "Though I heard," she added, "that the hollow where we lived acquired a reputation. People said it was haunted by the ghost of a black soldier who'd refused to run. They said you could hear rifle shots on spring nights and see smoke where no fires burned. Nonsense, of course. Superstition. But I liked knowing that the place remembered what happened there, even if only in stories. The hollow does still exist, now part of a state conservation area established in the late 1960s. Hikers occasionally pass through, following trails that wind through second-growth forest. Sometimes they find the old foundation, just a few courses of stone slowly being consumed by earth and roots. Most have no idea what they're looking at. There's no historical marker, no sign explaining what happened in Shepherd's Hollow on those April nights in 1866 and 1871. The official records are scattered across archives, court documents in Nashville, military records in Washington, newspaper accounts in Philadelphia and Tennessee. Assembling the full story requires research across multiple states and decades of documentation. The letters Hardin wrote have become historical artifacts in their own right. Scholars of Reconstruction cite them as rare first-hand accounts of Klan violence, unusual for their detail and their author's military precision. 3 of the letters are in the Library of Congress. 2 more were discovered in a Virginia estate sale in 1954, tucked inside a book about Civil War marksmanship. The final 2 have never been recovered, possibly lost or deliberately destroyed. What do you think of Nathaniel Hardin's stand? Would you have fought for land you'd rightfully purchased, or would you have left before it came to violence? In an era where legal protection meant little and federal authority was distant, was his resistance heroic or simply pragmatic survival? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story powerful, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. We bring you forgotten chapters of American history that don't make it into textbooks, stories of courage and resistance that deserve to be remembered. Share this with someone who appreciates tales of people who refuse to be erased from the land they'd earned. And remember, history isn't just about what's written in official records. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that were deliberately buried, the ones that survive only because someone refused to stay silent. See you in the next video.